On the morning of June 19, 1944, the sky over the Philippine Sea filled with aircraft, hundreds of them, converging at different altitudes, closing at hundreds of miles per hour. For most pilots, survival that day would depend on staying in formation, obeying vectors, and knowing when to disengage. For one man, it would become something else entirely. By nightfall, a single U.S. Navy fighter pilot would be credited with 9 confirmed aerial victories in 2 sorties, an achievement never repeated in naval aviation history. He would land his aircraft with almost no fuel remaining, not because he chased glory, but because discipline told him when to leave. The pilot was David McCampbell, and on that day he did not just dominate the air. He demonstrated what happens when training, judgment, and timing align perfectly in combat. David McCampbell did not look like the kind of man aviation legends are usually built around. He was not young, not reckless, and not particularly interested in being noticed. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, McCampbell was already older than most frontline fighter pilots and carried responsibilities that normally kept officers well away from the sharp end of combat. He was born in 1910, part of a generation that came of age between wars, not during one. His path into the Navy followed a conventional route for officers of the era. Education first, discipline always, ambition kept carefully in check. When he entered the U.S. Naval Academy, aviation was still a developing specialty, dangerous enough that it attracted fewer volunteers than surface warfare. Flying was not glamorous, it was technical, risky, and unforgiving. Naval aviation in the 1930s killed pilots with alarming regularity, often before they ever saw combat. Training accidents were common, carrier landings were brutal, decks were short, arresting gear was primitive, and visibility was often poor. There were no angled decks, no landing mirrors, and no tolerance for imprecision. A pilot who survived training was already demonstrating something more valuable than aggression, judgment. McCampbell earned his wings in this environment. He learned to fly when aircraft were underpowered, navigation was crude, and mistakes were fatal. That experience shaped him in ways that would later matter far more than raw reflexes. He was not the fastest learner in the class, but he was methodical. He absorbed procedures, respected limits, and understood that the Navy did not need lone wolves. It needed pilots who could land on a pitching deck after hours in the air. By the time war came, McCampbell was no longer just a pilot. He was an officer with command responsibilities. While younger men focused on perfecting gunnery and aerobatics, he was learning how to manage people, training schedules, aircraft readiness, and morale. These were not glamorous skills, but they were foundational ones. Naval aviation was becoming a system, and McCampbell understood systems. Age worked against him in one respect. Fighter squadrons increasingly favored younger pilots who could endure the physical strain of combat flying. Reflexes mattered, and fatigue killed. Many officers his age transitioned into staff roles or training commands. McCampbell did not resist this reality, but neither did he surrender his place in the cockpit. What separated him from many of his peers was not exceptional aggressiveness, but consistency. He flew the same way every time. He followed doctrine. He trusted formation tactics. He believed survival was not a matter of courage, but of preparation and restraint. In a culture that often celebrated daring, McCampbell quietly embodied something else: reliability. When the Navy expanded rapidly after Pearl Harbor, it needed experienced aviators to train new pilots and lead air groups. McCampbell found himself exactly where the institution needed him. He was promoted not because he sought it, but because he fit the moment. As aircraft improved and tactics matured, his earlier, harder-earned experience became an asset rather than a liability. By 1944, he would be commanding an air group aboard one of the Navy's newest fleet carriers. On paper, that should have placed him above the chaos of aerial combat. In practice, it would put him directly into it, at precisely the moment when naval aviation reached its most decisive test. David McCampbell did not set out to become an ace. He set out to do his job correctly. The fact that this approach would later produce the most lethal day in U.S. Navy fighter history was not the result of ambition. It was the result of everything that had come before. In the years before the United States entered the Second World War, naval aviation was not yet a prestige assignment. It was dangerous, underdeveloped, and often misunderstood by senior leadership that still viewed battleships as the decisive arm of sea power. Flying was tolerated because it showed promise, not because it had proven itself. For the men who volunteered, it came with an unspoken understanding. Mistakes would not be forgiven by the aircraft, the sea, or the deck crews waiting below. The Navy's aviation training pipeline in the 1930s reflected this reality. Selection was rigorous, but survival was never guaranteed, even after acceptance. Student pilots learned basic flight in relatively primitive aircraft, moved quickly into advanced training, and then faced the most difficult test of all, carrier qualification. Landing on a moving ship at sea demanded precision that few civilian aviators had ever experienced. There was no room for improvisation. A misjudged approach could destroy an aircraft, kill the pilot, or injure deck crewmen standing only feet away. Carrier decks of the era were short and unforgiving. There were no angled decks to allow wave-offs. A missed arresting wire meant crashing into parked aircraft or going over the side. Landing signal officers relied on hand signals and judgment rather than standardized optical aids. Weather often reduced visibility to the bare minimum, and pilots were expected to land anyway. These conditions filtered pilots quickly. Those who survived were not necessarily the boldest, but they were the most consistent. Training accidents were so common that they shaped Navy aviation culture as much as combat ever would. Pilots learned early that survival depended on discipline and repetition. Procedures existed for a reason. Deviating from them rarely ended well. This environment rewarded men who respected limits, who flew within their aircraft's envelope, and who treated every landing as a test rather than a routine event. Unlike the Army Air Forces, which emphasized individual initiative and increasingly celebrated the fighter pilot as a heroic figure, naval aviation remained institutionally conservative. A Navy pilot was part of a system. He flew in formation, took orders from fighter direction, and returned to a ship that depended on him not damaging it. The emphasis was always on coordination. A brilliant individual performance meant little if it disrupted the air group or endangered the carrier. This distinction mattered. As the Navy expanded rapidly after 1941, it needed pilots who could absorb doctrine and pass it on. The sudden influx of new aircraft and new airmen forced the service to rely heavily on experienced officers who understood not just how to fly, but how to teach. Combat experience was valuable, but so was the ability to instill habits that kept young pilots alive long enough to gain that experience themselves. For officers like David McCampbell, this system rewarded patience. He had learned to fly when navigation was unreliable, weather forecasting was crude, and emergency procedures were often theoretical. He had landed on decks that offered little margin for error and flown aircraft that punished overconfidence. Those experiences reinforced a simple truth: skill was inseparable from judgment. As the war progressed, training itself became more formalized. The Navy introduced standardized syllabi, improved aircraft, and clearer tactical doctrine. Yet the core philosophy remained unchanged. Pilots were taught to fight as a unit, to trust vectoring from ships equipped with radar, and to disengage when the situation demanded it. Chasing a kill at the expense of fuel or formation discipline was not admired, it was condemned. Fatigue also became a recognized factor. Carrier aviation demanded long hours, repeated sorties, and constant alertness. Pilots were expected to fly when ordered, sleep when possible, and accept that exhaustion was part of the job. Those who managed fatigue intelligently lasted longer. Those who ignored it often made mistakes that could not be corrected in time. By the time American carrier forces moved deep into the Pacific, naval aviation had matured into a finely tuned machine. Aircraft were better, but more importantly, pilots were better prepared. They were trained to survive first, fight second, and return to the ship every time, if at all possible. The Navy understood that losing an experienced pilot was far more damaging than missing a single opportunity for engagement. This training culture quietly shaped the kind of leaders who would define naval air combat in 1944. It favored officers who would balance aggression with restraint, who understood when to press an attack and when to break away. It rewarded those who trusted the system rather than their own instincts alone. David McCampbell emerged from this environment not as a flamboyant aviator, but as a product of its hard lessons. He carried forward habits learned long before the war: respect for procedure, awareness of limits, and an understanding that survival was the foundation of effectiveness. These qualities would soon be tested on a scale no pre-war exercise could have prepared him for, in a battle where training, not bravado, would decide the outcome. The aircraft that would define American naval air superiority in the latter half of the war was not designed to be elegant. It was not light nor particularly fast by land-based fighter standards. What it was designed to do, deliberately and without apology, was keep its pilot alive long enough to win. The F-6F Hellcat emerged from hard lessons learned early in the Pacific War. Encounters with the Japanese Zero had exposed painful weaknesses in earlier U.S. Navy fighters. American pilots found themselves facing an enemy aircraft that could outturn them, climb aggressively, and exploit mistakes with lethal efficiency. The answer was not to chase the Zero's strengths, but to negate them entirely. Grumman's engineers approached the problem with a blunt philosophy: survivability first. The Hellcat was built around a powerful engine, heavy armament, and structural strength that bordered on excess. It carried armor where earlier fighters had none. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its airframe could absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft outright. The result was a fighter that might not win a turning contest, but would almost always survive a mistake long enough to correct it. This mattered enormously at sea. Carrier aviation offered no safe landing options. A damaged aircraft had one place to go back to, and if it could not make that deck, the pilot was almost certainly lost. Every decision choice that increased the Hellcat's ability to limp home translated directly into lives saved and combat effectiveness sustained. Firepower was another deliberate choice. The Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns with ample ammunition, arranged to deliver dense, sustained fire in short engagement windows. Naval aviators were trained to fire only when the odds were decisively in their favor. A Hellcat pilot did not spray rounds hoping for a hit. He waited until geometry, closure rate, and angle aligned. When he fired, the result was often immediate and catastrophic for the target. The Hellcat's flight characteristics reinforced this doctrine. It climbed well, dove better, and retained energy in ways that allowed pilots to choose when to engage and when to disengage. It rewarded patience. Pilots who tried to fly at like a Zero, tight turns at low speed, were punished. Pilots who used altitude, speed, and coordinated attacks found themselves at a decisive advantage. This was not accidental. The Navy had learned that fighter combat over water demanded a different mindset than over land. There was no margin for ego. A pilot who overstayed an engagement risked fuel starvation, mechanical failure, or being caught alone by unseen enemies. Doctrine emphasized mutual support and disciplined attack profiles. The Hellcat was designed to enforce those habits mechanically. For a pilot like David McCampbell, the Hellcat was not merely suitable, it was ideal. His flying style emphasized planning over reaction. He understood energy management intuitively, not as an abstract theory, but as a practical necessity learned from years of flying underpowered aircraft in unforgiving conditions. The Hellcat amplified these instincts. It allowed him to fight on his terms, not the enemy's. Where some pilots saw the aircraft's weight as a liability, McCampbell recognized it as insurance. He did not need to outturn an opponent if he could outclimb, outdive, and outlast him. He trusted the aircraft to bring him home, and that trust shaped his decisions in combat. He was willing to disengage early, climb back to altitude, and re-enter the fight when conditions favored him. In the Hellcat, this was not cowardice, it was doctrine. The contrast with Japanese aircraft philosophy was stark. The Zero was optimized for range and maneuverability at the expense of protection. Early in the war, this made it formidable. As American pilots adapted, those same characteristics became liabilities. Zeros burned easily. Their pilots lacked armor. A single well-placed burst from a Hellcat could be decisive. The longer the war continued, the more this imbalance mattered. Equally important was how the Hellcat fit into a larger system. Radar-equipped ships provided early warning. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats into advantageous positions. Pilots were no longer hunting blindly. They were interceptors, guided to altitude and bearing with precision that earlier aviators could only have imagined. The Hellcat's endurance and stability made it ideal for this role. It could loiter, climb, and respond to instructions without overstressing either pilot or machine. This system rewarded officers who trusted it. McCampbell did not view fighter direction as interference. He viewed it as an extension of his own situational awareness. He accepted vectors, adjusted altitude, and waited for confirmation before committing. His kills would later appear spectacular in isolation, but they were the visible outcome of an invisible network working exactly as intended. The Hellcat also altered the psychology of combat. Pilots who believed their aircraft would protect them were more willing to make calm decisions under pressure. Panic kills. Confidence, properly grounded, preserves options. McCampbell's confidence was not bravado, it was procedural. He believed in checklists, in training, and in the knowledge that the aircraft beneath him had been designed for the exact environment he was operating in. By 1944, the Hellcat had become the dominant carrier fighter in the Pacific. Its success was not measured only in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in pilots returned safely to their ships. That metric mattered more to the Navy than any kill ratio. A carrier air group that retained its experienced pilots grew deadlier with every engagement. For McCampbell, the Hellcat was not a weapon to be mastered through daring. It was a tool to be used correctly. He flew it the way it was meant to be flown, aggressively when conditions were right, conservatively when they were not, and always with an eye toward getting back aboard ship. That philosophy, shared by the aircraft and the men, would soon be tested under the most demanding conditions naval aviation had ever faced. By the time David McCampbell took his place aboard USS Essex, the United States Navy had transformed the aircraft carrier from an auxiliary platform into the centerpiece of its offensive power. The Essex-class carriers were large, fast, and built for sustained operations far from friendly ports. They carried not just aircraft, but an entire ecosystem of men, machines, and procedures that had to function continuously under combat conditions. Life aboard a fast carrier was defined by routine layered over constant risk. Flight operations began before dawn and often continued until darkness made recovery too dangerous. Pilots lived on irregular sleep, grabbed meals when possible, and remained on alert even when not scheduled to fly. Every launch and recovery cycle involved dozens of aircraft, each one requiring precise timing and coordination. A single mistake on the flight deck could cascade into disaster. As Air Group Commander, McCampbell's responsibilities extended far beyond his own cockpit. He oversaw multiple squadrons, each with its own aircraft, pilots, maintenance crews, and schedules. He was responsible for training standards, tactical discipline, and operational readiness. When aircraft were lost or damaged, he had to decide how to redistribute pilots and machines to keep the group effective. These were not abstract decisions. They directly affected who flew, who rested, and who might not return. Carrier operations imposed constraints that land-based aviation never faced. Aircraft had limited fuel, limited spare parts, and nowhere else to go. Weather could shut down flight operations entirely, trapping aircraft in the air or forcing emergency landings. Combat damage had to be repaired at sea, often under the threat of renewed attack. Every decision had to account for these limitations. For commanders, the temptation to remain out of the cockpit was strong. Senior officers were valuable. Losing one in combat would disrupt operations far beyond the loss of a single aircraft. As the war progressed, many air group commanders limited their flying to essential missions or delegated combat sorties to subordinates. This was prudent. It was also at odds with the Navy's expectation that leaders understand combat firsthand. McCampbell chose a middle path. He flew regularly enough to remain current and credible, but he did not chase every engagement. When he did fly, it was because his presence served a purpose, either to lead by example or to fill a specific operational need. He understood that his value lay not in accumulating victories, but in keeping the air group functioning as a coherent whole. The carrier itself shaped behavior. On USS Essex, space was limited and privacy non-existent. Pilots lived in close quarters, shared risks, and depended on one another for survival. There was little room for ego. A pilot who disrupted operations or ignored procedures endangered not only himself, but everyone around him. Command authority was reinforced daily by the environment itself. Air group commanders were also intermediaries between pilots and the ship's command. They coordinated with the carrier's captain, air operations officers, and fighter direction teams. Decisions about launch times, mission priorities, and defensive patrols flowed through them. In combat, this meant balancing aggressive action with the carrier's need for protection. Sending too many fighters forward left the ship exposed. Holding too many back risked missing opportunities to intercept enemy strikes. McCampbell's approach reflected his training. He trusted radar and fighter direction. He believed in layered defense and disciplined interception. Rather than pushing pilots to seek individual engagements, he emphasized formation integrity and fuel awareness. He understood that the carrier's survival depended on coordination, not heroics. Fatigue was an ever-present concern. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, often under stress and with little rest. Commanders had to recognize when a pilot was no longer effective and ground him, even if that pilot insisted he could continue. These decisions were unpopular but necessary. An exhausted pilot was more dangerous to his own side than to the enemy. By mid-1944, USS Essex was operating a part of the Fast Carrier Task Force that represented the peak of American naval aviation. The system was efficient, lethal, and increasingly confident. Yet it was also stretched. The pace of operations allowed little margin for error. Every man aboard understood that the next engagement could test the limits of both equipment and endurance. For McCampbell, command at sea meant constant trade-offs. He had to be a pilot, a leader, and an administrator simultaneously. The skills that had once seemed secondary, planning, restraint, and attention to detail, were now central to survival. When the fleet sailed toward the Marianas, those skills would be tested under conditions no training exercise could replicate. By the spring of 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a decisive phase. The United States Navy was no longer probing forward in cautious steps. It was advancing deliberately toward objectives that threatened Japan's ability to continue the war at all. Chief among these objectives were the Mariana Islands. Their capture would place American airfields within bomber range of the Japanese home islands and sever key lines of communication across the Pacific. For Japan, the Marianas represented a red line. Losing them would mean more than territorial defeat. It would mean strategic exposure. Japanese naval planners understood this and prepared to commit what remained of their carrier aviation to stop the American advance. The result would be the confrontation later known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But the outcome was shaped long before the first aircraft launched. The imbalance between the two sides in 1944 was not merely numerical, though that alone was stark. American carrier task forces fielded hundreds of modern aircraft, flown by pilots who benefited from an increasingly refined training pipeline. Replacement pilots arrived continuously, trained under standardized programs that emphasized formation flying, gunnery discipline, and coordination with radar-equipped ships. Experience accumulated rather than dissipated. Japan's situation was the inverse. Years of combat had hollowed out its pool of experienced naval aviators. Early war veterans, once the backbone of carrier air groups, had been lost faster than they could be replaced. Training programs were compressed to meet demand, producing pilots with fewer hours and less exposure to complex carrier operations. Aircraft, while still dangerous in the right hands, were increasingly flown by men who lacked the experience to exploit their strengths or survive prolonged engagements. Fuel shortages further eroded Japanese readiness. Pilots arrived at the battle with limited flight time, little opportunity for advanced training, and minimal coordination with radar or centralized fighter direction. The Japanese Navy still believed in offensive spirit, but spirit alone could not compensate for structural collapse. The Americans, by contrast, had turned naval aviation into an integrated system. Radar picket ships extended the fleet's eyes hundreds of miles outward. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers and cruisers tracked incoming formations and issued vectors to combat air patrols with increasing precision. Pilots no longer searched blindly for the enemy. They were guided to altitude, bearing, and timing that maximized advantage. This system fundamentally altered the nature of air combat. Engagements became asymmetric before they began. American fighters often entered the fight from above, with speed and energy already in hand. Japanese pilots, flying long distances from their carriers, arrived fatigued and low on fuel, forced to fight at a disadvantage simply to reach the fleet. Doctrine evolved accordingly. U.S. pilots were instructed to intercept, disrupt, and destroy incoming strikes, then disengage promptly to refuel and rearm. The goal was not pursuit for its own sake, but fleet defense. Every enemy aircraft destroyed before reaching release range increased the carrier's odds of survival. Individual heroics were secondary to maintaining the integrity of the defensive screen. The Japanese plan relied on mass. They intended to launch large strikes packages, overwhelm American defenses, and deliver decisive blows against the carriers. It was a plan that might have worked earlier in the war, when pilot skill and aircraft performance were closer to parity. By mid-1944, it was dangerously outdated. Mass without coordination became a liability, creating congested formations that were easier to detect, track, and intercept. As American task forces approached the Marianas, their confidence rested not on optimism, but on evidence. Previous engagements had demonstrated the effectiveness of radar-directed interception. Pilots trusted the system because it worked. Commanders trusted it because it preserved their aircraft and crews. Every successful interception reinforced the doctrine. For air group commanders like David McCampbell, the approaching battle was less about individual opportunity than about execution. The coming days would demand strict adherence to procedure. Fighters would need to be launched, vectored, and recovered with minimal delay. Fuel management would be critical. Fatigue would be unavoidable. Mistakes would compound quickly. The Navy understood that this battle would test more than aircraft and pilots. It would test whether years of doctrinal refinement had produced a force capable of decisive, sustained combat. The Marianas operation was not an experiment, it was a culmination. Japanese pilots would fly into the teeth of this system, believing they were carrying the last chance to turn the war. American pilots would meet them with an understanding that they were defending not just ships, but a strategic trajectory that had been building for years. When the first radar contacts appeared on June 19, 1944, the outcome was not yet inevitable, but the conditions that would shape it were firmly in place. Training, technology, and doctrine had already tilted the balance. What remained was execution in the air, where those systems would be tested by men flying at the limits of endurance and judgment. For David McCampbell, that test was about to become intensely personal. The first warning did not come from a lookout or a pilot's eyes, but from radar. Long before the Japanese strike aircraft were visible, contacts began appearing on the scopes of American ships spread across the task force. Bearings, ranges, and altitudes were plotted and refined as the formations closed the distance. The system worked exactly as it had been designed to: detect early, intercept high, and break the attack before it reached the carriers. Aboard the USS Essex, the response was immediate. Fighters were ordered into the air as part of the combat air patrol, climbing hard to reach assigned altitudes. David McCampbell launched with his section, knowing that this was not a routine intercept. The size and number of contacts indicated something larger, an organized strike rather than a probing attack. Once airborne, the fight ceased to be abstract. Fighter direction began issuing vectors, adjusting headings and altitudes as radar returns sharpened. Bandits bearing 270, Angels 12. The call was procedural, unemotional. McCampbell acknowledged and turned his aircraft into the climb, throttling back just enough to manage engine temperatures while gaining altitude. There was no rush to close distance prematurely. Altitude was insurance. Speed could be traded later. As the Hellcats climbed, the incoming Japanese formation began to resolve visually. Bombers and escorting fighters approached in loose groups, already showing signs of strain from the long flight. They had burned fuel simply reaching the fleet. McCampbell recognized the geometry immediately. This was an intercept with the advantage firmly in American hands. He positioned himself above and ahead of the enemy, maintaining separation long enough to choose his moment. This was not a chaotic melee. It was a sequence of deliberate attacks. Diving passes allowed him to convert altitude into speed, fire in short, controlled bursts, and climb away before becoming entangled. His first kills came quickly. A bomber caught low and slow, its formation already broken, absorbed a concentrated burst, and fell away trailing smoke. Another followed moments later. Campbell did not linger to confirm outcomes visually. He trusted the results and repositioned for the next attack. Radio traffic reflected the scale of the engagement. Calls overlapped as pilots reported contacts, damage, and fuel stages. Fighter direction continued to feed updates, adjusting vectors as formations fragmented. Multiple bandits breaking south. McCampbell adjusted his heading, scanning constantly. Situational awareness mattered more than fixation. The temptation to chase was ever present, but discipline held. Each pass was made with an exit in mind. Each climb restored options. As the engagement continued, Japanese resistance diminished rapidly. Escorting fighters attempted to intervene, but they were outmatched. They lacked altitude, coordination, and the energy to dictate terms. McCampbell dispatched them with the same efficiency, striking when angles were favorable and disengaging before risk accumulated. By the time the sky cleared, he had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft. It was an extraordinary tally, but in the moment it registered only as a sequence of completed tasks. There was no pause for reflection. Fuel was becoming a concern. McCampbell checked his gauges and made the call. Low fuel, breaking off. It was not a request, it was a statement of fact. The Hellcat had given him every advantage it could, but no aircraft could manufacture fuel in midair. He turned back toward the fleet, descending gradually to conserve what remained. Recovery aboard the carrier was uneventful but tight. Many aircraft were returning simultaneously, some damaged, all low on fuel. Deck crews worked at maximum speed, clearing landing areas and cycling aircraft below as quickly as possible. McCampbell trapped cleanly and rolled clear, his aircraft showing the signs of heavy use, but no serious damage. He had barely shut down when the next reality asserted itself. Radar contacts were still appearing. Not all of the Japanese strikes had been intercepted. Another wave was inbound. Normally a pilot in his position would have been done for the cycle. He had flown a demanding intercept, expended ammunition, and burned fuel aggressively. His responsibilities as Air Group Commander would have justified remaining on deck to coordinate the next response. But the situation did not allow for comfort or protocol. Aircraft were being refueled and rearmed at speed. Pilots were being reassigned. Every available fighter mattered. McCampbell did not hesitate. He climbed out of the cockpit, received a rapid briefing update, and prepared to launch again. The system had worked. The first strike had been shattered before it could threaten the carriers. But the battle was not over. The next sortie would be flown under even tighter constraints, with less fuel margin and growing fatigue. What had already been an exceptional performance was about to become something unprecedented. Not because McCampbell sought it, but because the situation demanded it. There was no ceremony to the relaunch. Aircraft were turned, fueled, rearmed, and sent back into the air as quickly as the deck crews could manage. The pace of operations left little time for rest or reflection. For David McCampbell, the second launch came not as a calculated decision, but as an immediate response to unfolding events. Radar contacts still showed inbound aircraft, and every fighter that could fly was needed. The briefing was short and direct. Another group of Japanese aircraft was approaching from the west, scattered and disorganized after the first intercepts, but still dangerous. McCampbell climbed back into a freshly serviced Hellcat, aware that the margin for error was shrinking. Fuel loads were conservative. Time in the air would be limited. The emphasis would be on rapid interception and immediate disengagement. Once airborne, fighter direction resumed its steady stream of instructions. Bandits bearing 290, Angels 10. McCampbell acknowledged and adjusted course. The climb felt heavier this time, not because the aircraft was different, but because fatigue was beginning to register. Hours of tension and exertion take their toll even on disciplined pilots. He compensated by relying more heavily on procedure. Scan, check instruments, maintain spacing, trust the vector. The engagement was shorter and more fragmented than the first. The remaining Japanese aircraft were fewer in number and lacked cohesion. Some attempted to press toward the fleet, others turned away when intercepted. This created a series of brief, isolated fights rather than a single sustained engagement. McCampbell made 2 attacks. Each was executed with the same economy of motion as before. He entered from altitude, fired only when the target filled his sights, and broke away immediately after the burst. Both enemy aircraft were destroyed cleanly. There was no temptation to pursue further. Fuel awareness dominated every decision. Radio traffic reflected the urgency of the moment. Multiple bandits disengaging, fuel state critical. McCampbell glanced at his gauges and confirmed what he already knew. He was near the limit. The decision to return was not dramatic, it was inevitable. Essex, this is McCampbell. Fuel state critical. The reply was brief, focused on recovery sequencing rather than commentary. The carrier was already handling a steady stream of returning aircraft, some with damage, others barely airborne on fumes. The deck crew had no margin for delay. The approach was tense but controlled. With fuel nearly exhausted, there would be no second attempt if something went wrong. McCampbell flew a precise pattern, lined up carefully, and trapped successfully. The aircraft rolled to a stop with little fuel left in the tanks. It was the kind of landing that left no room for relief until the engine was shut down and the aircraft chocked. Only then did the scale of the day begin to register. 9 confirmed victories and 2 sorties. It was an achievement unmatched in naval aviation. But aboard the carrier, it was absorbed quietly, almost clinically. There was still work to be done. The battle was ongoing, and individual tallies mattered far less than the survival of the fleet. McCampbell returned to his command role immediately. He reviewed pilot reports, monitored radar updates, and coordinated subsequent defensive patrols. Fatigue was set aside in favor of responsibility. The system had held, but it would be tested again before the day was over. What distinguished McCampbell's performance was not the number of aircraft destroyed, but the way the engagements were conducted. He had flown with doctrine, respected fuel limits, and disengaged when required. His kills were not the result of reckless pursuit, but of positioning, timing, and restraint. By the end of June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation had been dealt a blow from which it would never recover. For McCampbell, the day marked the culmination of years of training and disciplined command. The record it produced would stand unmatched, not because it was impossible to repeat, but because it required conditions and a pilot aligned with almost surgical precision. The battle would continue, recognition would come later. For now, there was only the task at hand, keeping aircraft in the air, pilots alive, and the carrier protected as the war moved inexorably forward. The events of June 19, 1944 did not elevate David McCampbell above his responsibilities. They intensified them. While his performance in the air would later be recognized as extraordinary, his role aboard the carrier remained fundamentally unchanged. He was still an air group commander, responsible for the effectiveness and survival of every squadron under his authority. Leadership in naval aviation was rarely about inspiration in the abstract. It was about enforcement of standards, procedures, and discipline, often in the face of fatigue and frustration. Pilots wanted to fly. They wanted to engage. They wanted to believe that aggression alone would carry them through combat. McCampbell understood that these instincts had to be tempered. An air group that lost pilots faster than it destroyed enemy aircraft would eventually fail, regardless of individual bravery. His approach emphasized preparation over spectacle. Pilots were briefed thoroughly and debriefed without embellishment. Engagements were analyzed for what went right and what nearly went wrong. Fuel management, formation integrity, and adherence to vectors were treated as combat skills, not administrative concerns. McCampbell made it clear that survival was not the absence of courage, but the result of professionalism. This philosophy influenced how younger pilots flew. They learned quickly that breaking formation without cause, chasing damaged aircraft beyond fuel limits, or ignoring fighter direction was unacceptable. These were not matters of personal style. They were violations that endangered the carrier and everyone aboard it. McCampbell enforced these standards consistently, regardless of rank or reputation. He also understood the human limits of his pilots. Fatigue was not a weakness to be scolded away. It was a condition to be managed. Pilots were rotated when possible. Those who showed signs of exhaustion were grounded, even if they protested. This sometimes cost the air group experienced fighters in the short term, but it preserved effectiveness over sustained operations. In the air, McCampbell led by example without seeking attention. He flew when his presence served a purpose, not to pad a record. When he did fly, his behavior reinforced the standards he demanded of others. He disengaged when fuel dictated. He followed vectors. He avoided unnecessary risk. Pilots noticed these choices. They carried weight precisely because they were not theatrical. On the deck, leadership took a different form. McCampbell coordinated constantly with shipboard command, fighter direction officers, and maintenance crews. Aircraft readiness was as much a leadership issue as tactics. A perfectly flown intercept meant little if aircraft were unavailable for the next one. He worked to ensure that maintenance crews were supported and that pilots understood the limits imposed by mechanical reality. This relationship between pilots and deck crews was critical. Carrier aviation depended on mutual trust. Pilots trusted that their aircraft had been prepared correctly. Deck crews trusted pilots to follow procedures that kept everyone alive during launch and recovery. McCampbell reinforced this trust by treating both groups as integral parts of the same system. His leadership style contrasted sharply with the more romanticized image of fighter aces. He did not cultivate a persona. He did not encourage competition for kills. Victories were acknowledged, but they were framed as outcomes of teamwork rather than individual brilliance. This was not false modesty. It was a deliberate effort to prevent morale from becoming dependent on a few high performers. The result was an air group that functioned reliably under pressure. Pilots understood their roles and limits. Procedures were followed even when adrenaline tempted shortcuts. This consistency paid dividends in later operations, where sustained combat placed even greater strain on men and machines. McCampbell's leadership did not end with the battle. In the days that followed, he continued to fly, brief, and manage operations as the fleet consolidated its position in the Marianas. The intensity of June 19th was not an anomaly, but a preview of the demands that modern carrier warfare imposed. What distinguished him was not the way he could rise to those demands in a crisis, but that he had built a command culture capable of absorbing them. His achievements in the air were inseparable from his effectiveness as a leader on the deck. Together, they formed a model of command that prioritized survival, cohesion, and sustained combat power over fleeting glory. Recognition came later, and it came deliberately. The Navy did not rush to elevate individual actions during an ongoing campaign, especially when those actions were inseparable from a larger system at work. But as reports were consolidated and after-action summaries compared, the scale of David McCampbell's performance on June 19, 1944 became impossible to treat as routine. 9 confirmed aerial victories in 2 sorties stood apart even in a battle defined by lopsided results. More importantly, those victories were achieved under conditions that magnified their significance. McCampbell was not a junior pilot operating with freedom from responsibility. He was an air group commander, flying in defense of the fleet, adhering to doctrine, and disengaging when fuel and situation demanded. The actions were not reckless. They were controlled, repeatable, and decisive. The Navy already had a framework for recognizing aerial combat achievements. Many pilots received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, and the bar for the Medal of Honor in aviation was set deliberately high. By 1944, it was awarded sparingly, often for actions that combined exceptional personal risk with decisive impact on the mission. McCampbell's case met that threshold not because of the number of aircraft destroyed alone, but because of the circumstances under which they were destroyed. The citation emphasized leadership as much as combat skill. It noted that McCampbell pressed repeated attacks against enemy formations despite heavy opposition, and that his actions materially reduced the threat to the carrier task force. The focus was not on individual duels, but on the protection of ships and air crews. This framing reflected the Navy's values. Heroism was measured by contribution to the mission, not personal daring. For McCampbell, the award was not transformative. Those who served with him remarked on the absence of any visible change in his behavior. He did not alter his leadership style or his expectations of his pilots. Briefings remained procedural. Debriefings remained analytical. The day of extraordinary success did not become a reference point for indulgence or mythology. Promotion followed, as it often did for officers whose performance combined combat effectiveness with command capability. Yet even this advancement did not remove McCampbell from operational responsibility. He continued to fly when necessary and to manage air group operations as the campaign progressed. The demands of the war left little room for ceremony. The Medal of Honor also placed McCampbell in a small and unusual category within naval aviation. Few aviators received the award for aerial combat alone, and fewer still did so while serving in a command role. His actions bridged two worlds, the tactical reality of fighter combat and the strategic necessity of flight defense. This duality made his recognition distinct from that of pilots whose heroism was defined by a single, isolated act. In the broader context of war, the award served another purpose. It reinforced confidence in naval aviation at a moment when the carrier had decisively eclipsed the battleship. McCampbell's performance embodied the maturity of that transition. He was not improvising in the air. He was executing a doctrine that had been refined through years of hard experience. For the men who flew under his command, the award carried weight, not because it elevated McCampbell above them, but because it validated the system they all depended on. It demonstrated that discipline, restraint, and coordination could produce results as dramatic as any act of individual audacity. The Medal of Honor marked the formal acknowledgement of what had already become clear to those who understood naval aviation. David McCampbell's achievements were not an anomaly. They were the visible outcome of preparation meeting opportunity at exactly the right moment, under the leadership of an officer who understood both the limits and the potential of modern air combat. When the intensity of sustained carrier combat finally eased, there was no clean transition from war to peace for the men who had lived inside the machinery of naval aviation. Operations continued, patrols flew, and the demands of command did not recede simply because the most dramatic battle was over. For David McCampbell, the period after June 1944 was defined less by recognition than by continuity. The job still had to be done. He continued to serve in leadership roles as the Pacific Campaign advanced, overseeing air operations, training replacements, and maintaining combat readiness. By this stage of the war, experience was the Navy's most valuable and most fragile asset. Veteran pilots were irreplaceable in the short term, and commanders were expected to preserve them whenever possible. McCampbell's earlier instincts, discipline, restraint, and system-level thinking were now fully aligned with institutional priorities. As Japan's air power declined further, opportunities for aerial combat became less frequent. This did not make operations easier. Long-range strikes, reconnaissance, and defensive patrols still imposed strain on men and machines. The danger shifted from massed enemy formations to mechanical failure, weather, and fatigue. In many ways, these risks were harder to manage because they lacked a visible adversary. When the war ended, McCampbell remained in the Navy. Like many officers whose career had been shaped by rapid wartime expansion, he transitioned into a service grappling with peacetime realities. Budgets contracted, forces were reduced. The Navy that emerged after 1945 was smaller, more professionalized, and increasingly oriented towards deterrence rather than constant combat operations. McCampbell advanced to flag rank, a progression that reflected not only his combat record, but his effectiveness as a leader and administrator. This phase of his career placed him further from the cockpit and closer to institutional decision-making. It was a shift he accepted without visible regret. Flying had always been a means to an end, not an identity to be protected at all costs. Notably, he did not seek public attention. In an era where some wartime aviators became symbols, authors, or lecturers, McCampbell remained largely private. He did not cultivate a personal legend. He did not challenge official narratives or promote his own achievements. This was consistent with the culture that had shaped him. Naval aviation rewarded contribution, not celebrity. The contrast with the post-war trajectory of many Army Air Force's pilots was striking. The newly independent U.S. Air Force embraced public narratives of individual aces and technological progress. Jet aircraft, speed records, and test pilot culture captured attention. Navy aviators, by comparison, receded into relative obscurity, their wartime achievements absorbed into institutional history rather than popular memory. McCampbell did not resist this obscurity. He appeared comfortable, allowing his record to speak quietly for itself. Those who served with him remembered him not as a larger-than-life figure, but as a steady presence, competent, fair, and demanding in ways that made sense only to those who understood the stakes. In retirement, he lived without fanfare. There were no efforts to reframe his wartime service for modern audiences or to capitalize on his uniqueness. This absence of self-promotion was not accidental. It reflected a belief, common among officers of his generation, that the work mattered more than the recognition attached to it. As the decades passed, newer conflicts and new technologies reshaped public understanding of air combat. The era of piston-engine fighters and carrier battles faded into the background. McCampbell's achievements remained extraordinary, but they were no longer widely discussed outside specialist circles. Yet within naval aviation, his career retained quiet significance. He represented a type of officer whose value was not confined to a single moment of heroism. His post-war service underscored that the qualities which produce success in combat, discipline, judgment, and respect for systems, were equally valuable in peace. When the shooting stopped, those qualities endured, shaping a Navy that would soon face an entirely new strategic landscape. Measured purely by numbers, David McCampbell's record is unimpeachable. With 34 confirmed aerial victories, he remains the highest-scoring ace in United States Navy history. No other naval aviator would ever surpass him, and no one would ever repeat what he achieved on June 19, 1944. Yet numbers alone do not explain why his legacy endures within naval aviation, even as his name remains unfamiliar to much of the public. What set McCampbell apart was not simply effectiveness in combat, but the manner in which that effectiveness was achieved. His victories were the product of discipline rather than impulse, restraint rather than bravado. He did not redefine tactics through innovation or daring improvisation. Instead, he demonstrated the full potential of a system that had finally matured. Training, radar, fighter direction, aircraft design, and leadership converged in his cockpit, producing results that looked extraordinary precisely because they were executed correctly. This distinction matters. Many celebrated fighter aces are remembered as exceptional individuals operating at the edge of doctrine. McCampbell's legacy is different. He operated squarely within established procedures, proving that doctrine itself, when refined and respected, could be decisive. His career validated the Navy's belief that coordinated action and disciplined execution would outperform individual brilliance over time. Within naval aviation, this lesson carried lasting influence. Post-war carrier operations continued to emphasize formation discipline, fuel management, and centralized control. The technologies evolved. Jets replaced propellers, missiles replaced guns, but the underlying principles remained recognizable. Pilots were still taught to trust systems, respect limits, and disengage when conditions dictated. These habits trace their lineage directly to the wartime experiences of officers like McCampbell. The quiet nature of his legacy also reflects institutional culture. The Navy has never been comfortable elevating individuals above the organization. Ships, air groups, and task forces matter more than personalities. McCampbell fit this culture perfectly. He did not challenge it, and it did not need to celebrate him loudly to preserve his example. His record was acknowledged, documented, and absorbed. This absorption into institutional memory helps explain why his stories resist popular retelling. There is little spectacle to exaggerate. There are no dramatic confrontations to fictionalize without distorting the truth. His most remarkable achievement occurred in the middle of a massive, system-driven battle where individual actions were inseparable from collective effort. That makes for less convenient storytelling, but more accurate history. Modern air combat professionals tend to recognize this distinction instinctively. Pilots operating in complex, networked environments understand that success is rarely solitary. Information flows, command decisions, and logistical support shape outcomes long before weapons are released. McCampbell's career reads less like a legend and more like a case study in how to function effectively inside such a system. The enduring significance of June 19, 1944, lies not only in the collapse of Japanese naval aviation, but in what it revealed about modern warfare. Industrial capacity, training depth, and doctrinal coherence had become decisive. Individual skill still mattered, but only when aligned with those larger forces. McCampbell embodied that alignment. His legacy, then, is not one of spectacle, but of confirmation. He confirmed that preparation outweighs impulse, that leadership matters as much as marksmanship, that restraint can be lethal when applied at the right moment. These are not romantic conclusions, but they are durable ones. In the end, David McCampbell represents a type of hero that history often overlooks. The professional whose excellence is so tightly integrated into a larger system that it becomes difficult to separate the man from the method. His achievements remain unmatched, not because others lacked courage or skill, but because replicating his success would require recreating the precise convergence of training, technology, leadership, and timing that defined his moment. That convergence happened once, high over the Philippine Sea. The result still stands as a benchmark, not just of what a pilot can do, but of what disciplined warfare looks like when it works exactly as intended. High above the Philippine Sea, the Air War of June 1944 unfolded at a scale that made individual actions almost disappear into the noise. Hundreds of aircraft moved across vast distances, guided by radar, coordinated by unseen officers, and sustained by an industrial system unlike anything the world had seen before. In that environment, heroism did not announce itself with speeches or dramatic gestures. It appeared briefly, did its work, and vanished back into the formation. David McCampbell's story endures precisely because it resists easy myth-making. His most extraordinary day was not defined by risk-taking for its own sake, but by decisions made within narrow margins. When to engage, when to disengage, when to trust the system, and when to accept its limits. 9 enemy aircraft fell not because he defined doctrine, but because he followed it with absolute discipline. Modern warfare often celebrates speed, innovation, and individual brilliance. McCampbell's career offers a quieter lesson. Preparation matters more than improvisation. Coordination outperforms instinct. Survival is not the opposite of courage. It is the condition that makes courage useful. Those truths are not confined to piston engine fighters or carrier decks. They persist wherever complex systems depend on human judgment under pressure. There were no dramatic epilogues to his service, no attempt to reshape memory or elevate personal achievement above collective effort. When the war ended, McCampbell returned to a Navy already looking toward new technologies and new conflicts. His record remained documented and unquestioned, but it did not demand attention. That may be the most fitting end. His legacy does not belong to a single man, but to a moment when training, leadership, and technology aligned so completely that the outcome appeared effortless. In reality, it was anything but. It was the product of years of preparation and a refusal to confuse glory with effectiveness. On June 19, 1944, David McCampbell did not chase history. He did his job with precision. History followed anyway. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?